Good afternoon, and welcome to our Extron webinar for Thursday, October 11th, 2012. This webinar is part of our new paradigm in supply chain design, supply chain game changers series. And I want to welcome you to the one that we're calling New Strategies for Managing Transportation Costs in Global Supply Chains. Doug Nesbitt, and I want to welcome you to today's call. Today's presenter is Sandeep Duggal, the CEO of Extron. Sandeep has served as the CEO of Extron since 2002. Mr. Duggal has been responsible for setting and executing the company's strategy, business development, and overall company performance. Prior to joining Extron, Mr. Duggal worked at Sun Microsystems, Intel Corporation, and the Monitor Company. Mr. Duggal holds an undergraduate degree in mechanical engineering from the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, a graduate degree in industrial engineering and engineering management from Stanford University, and an MBA with distinction from the Harvard Business School, Harvard University. If you have any questions during the presentation, please send them over via the questions function in the WebEx webinar interface panel, and we'll address those at the end of the presentation. If you'd like to schedule an individual discussion with Sandeep, please send an email directly to Sandeep, and contact information will be given at the end. And I want to thank you, Sandeep, for presenting today. And at this point, I will turn the webinar over to you.
Thanks, Doug. Glad to be here. Appreciate everybody making the time to be here also, especially with busy and challenging lunch hour. So, as Doug mentioned, this is part of our supply chain game changer series. It's a webinar series designed to cover changes in supply chain, and one of the key changes, and probably one of the most evident changes, is how transportation costs have changed over the last 20 or 30 years since the supply chain, since the outsourcing phenomenon began. So that's the focus of this webinar. There are 4 other webinars in the series, so a total of 5, and we invite you to check our website whenever to see when it's scheduled. So, to begin with, let's cover a little bit about what we're going to be looking at today. First of all, a little bit of a historical perspective on the globalization of supply chains, cover some new dynamics affecting overseas supply chains, discuss a new model for adaptive supply chain design, discuss a case study, and then finally head into questions and answers. We're a little bit behind schedule, so I'll run a little fast through the early section of this. Some quick opening thoughts on this about transportation specifically. This is let's just say, it's a part of the supply chain that has typically not been looked at. And is not heavily looked at by supply chain managers because transportation was considered very low cost. It was part of the cost of doing business, and it looked at as a period cost more than cost of goods sold. However, how much things changed? Oil ran up from $10 a barrel in 1992 to $100 a barrel today. And a lot of other variables such as security fees and so on are coming into play. We'll cover that later. Companies used to spend much lower amounts on their product costs. Nowadays, transportation costs can be 6 to 13% of the cost of goods sold, and for companies accustomed to penny pinching, that is just a huge opportunity. In general, I'd say that the genesis of these high transportation costs has been the globalization of supply chain. In general, companies moved offshore. There was very hands-off management of supply. After all, if you're going to outsource, then you may as well outsource all the way and let your supplier take care of all the direct work. And companies began, especially in the U.S., focusing on sales and marketing and not really supply chain oversight. As we discussed in the previous webinar, the pendulum has swung very far and has begun to swing back for a variety of reasons. We covered this in more detail in other webinars, but for the most part, let's cover 3 main topics over here. First, labor costs are increasing rapidly and dramatically. This chart shows what's happened to labor costs in Asia. I think most people in the U.S. would love to see this kind of wage growth And as we know, this just isn't happening. Wage growth has been, just in the last 6 years, 150% in urban areas in China, and this is just until 2008, when the data was last compiled, but it is much higher than this today, and increasingly so. Oil prices, as we mentioned, have gone from historical lows as recently as 1992, being around $10 a barrel, and then you see where they are today. And then other transportation costs. This is one of my favorite slides. I love to look at the cost of the actual ocean freight charge. This is a little bit tongue in cheek, but you add up certainly the pickup and delivery and the ocean freight charges, and you see that it's sitting around 450. And when you add everything else up, the bond fees, the customs fees, the security fees, the X-rays, and this, by the way, I should point out, in 2009, and those fees have actually gone up further since then. So you end up basically more than tripling the actual cost. So these are only some of the things, but the net result has been that where the U.S. cost is 100%, and costs from overseas may have been as low as 60–70% up the U.S. baseline, you can see where those costs are going. Indeed, there are estimates that say that cost of manufacturing in China may reach parity on a purchasing price parity basis in 2016, which is unbelievable. People do not believe that when you look at the cost of wages, but there's a lot more than wages involved. Transportation costs, longer supply chain costs, and we'll get into some of those lately, but it's amazing to look at how narrow the cost differential has become. Okay. So that's just the cost side of the base, but there's other realities that have also become a challenge for everybody. First is the marketplace is becoming very, very competitive. There's more demand for customization. Retail is where it's most obvious, but you can look at any tech company and realize that they are also providing customers products in much more customizable products. They want to configure it at the last minute. They want to be able to offer the customer what they want. And there's faster product evolution cycle. So we all know how quickly A211 evolved from A211B, G, then N, and now goes beyond that. So the result for companies with long supply chain is basically rush product in, which means you fly in, and if anything's gone up faster than ocean transport rates, it's air transport rates. And simply because fuel constitutes an even larger percentage of the base cost over there, 40% in most estimates. And so the rush delivery price cost is significant, or the other opportunity is wait and you use sales opportunities. Clearly, most companies have gone the rush delivery, but those that can't take the delay delivery option and end up losing sales. Now, the clear solution on this is we have to understand what transportation is. Transportation is nothing more than an enabler of a globalized or indeed a distributed supply chain. Every item's got to be looked at in terms of landed cost, and only then can we achieve a true analysis of what the true cost of a globalized supply chain is. Now, I need to emphasize that we're not against globalization. Globalization is a fantastic thing. It's done great things for the world economy and for people all over the world. But the only true measure of the product is landed cost. And the term thin metrics is used when it looks at problems that we call selective metrics or selective reasoning. When you want to look at costs in ways that benefit you, or whether you be an upstream manufacturer, or whether you be a person inside an OEM trying to justify an offshore supply chain. I think that Thin metrics are unjustifiable, and companies have to look at their supply chain in terms of total landed cost. But you also have to look at it in terms of inventory cost, cost of obsolescence, price erosion. These are all critical issues for an Asia-based supply chain that go over and above the cost of transportation. So let's look at some of these very quickly. It's clearly the cost of capital. When you've got a longer supply chain, you have a higher cost of capital because you've got more inventory. But obsolescence, when you've got a longer supply chain, you've got more finished goods inventory, you're going to have higher obsolescence costs. There's clearly price curve effects. Product today costs less than it cost yesterday. This is 100% true in technology, and it deals with increasing productivity, but especially in technology. And so by having longer supply chains, you bought product at yesterday's prices as opposed to buying them at today's prices, and so therefore you paid more. One just has to look at the flash memory, the disk drive, the semiconductor, general semiconductor products such as microprocessors, and you realize the price curve effect is actually very significant. That is other things. With more inventory, you're going to warehouse it. With more inventory, you're going to have danger of infringement, damage. You're going to need to insure it with property tax considerations when it comes to inventory, and then just the cost of managing administrative. So the true cost of inventory when consulting studies in the major international consulting firm was looked at 5 to 10% per month, not just a modest 1% per month, as implied by the weighted average cost of capital, 1 to 2% implied by the weighted average cost of capital. So, what does this mean? Cost of obsolescence means that companies very often make decisions and fly their product over to reduce the cost of obsolescence, but thereby increase their transportation cost. So transportation cost can be looked at as a balancer of some of these other costs. But the trouble is that when you transport products very fast, you increase your transportation cost dramatically, which is where we came to that 6 to 13% of cost of goods sold number. Now remember, transportation costs are structurally controllable. That's extremely important feature of this. Just stepping backwards a little bit, we can look at, we talk about solid-state device cost per gigabyte, and you just see how that has dropped dramatically. In just 3 years, prices have gone down, over 4x. So this is a very significant price erosion, and it's continuing to be faster. You just have to go to the cost to look at the price of flash memory, USB memory stick right now. It's much more pronounced at the OEM level. So, what do we suggest? We think current supply chain architecture is based on economics of the 1980s and 1990s. We need to think of the piece that absolutely has to be globalized for cost reasons or for supply reasons. And then think of what piece has to be or should be localized. And think of the supply chain as global as opposed to a global supply chain. Secondly, add control of every step of the supply chain. And this is part of another webinar that we propose to you that there's a structure called last mile manufacturing that is much more robust. We'll get into it on the next slide. But add control and levers at every step. These control levers will help you structurally control your supply chain, and much more, many other very important levers like IP, risk, so on and so forth. So this is the classic supply chain today. Everything is done offshore, and then just a very few final activities domestically, specifically on distribution, and a whole bunch of support activities being done domestically. Some of these may actually, like returns, be offshore too, but generally it is completely inexcusable to do that offshore because the cost of handling returns offshore is very, very high. But that is a topic for another webinar. So how we suggest that the supply chains we look at is that should be looked at in terms of a globalized piece and a last mile piece. And in today's economics, we suggest a final configuration for these supply chains be looked at as being domestic. Let me just go over that very quickly. We believe that the final configuration really belongs in market, and that is how we structure and control IP loss, that is how we structure and control freight, because it allows you to take certain costly components or certain IP-sensitive components and place them, let's go over that again, and start placing them in market. So for technology manufacturer, this means take your heavy power supply and chassis and integrate them into your product at a very low labor cost in market. This also means you can configure your product and respond much more dynamically to your customers. So the advantages of this supply chain format are giving you many more control points for levers, lower landed costs, reduced inventory, reduced IP costs. All these are actually points covered in other webinars. But from our perspective, the lower landed cost, the lower transportation cost is our focus. And having that lower transportation cost will be what we look at in the couple of slides, how you actually can drop your transportation rate and reduce your total cost. So let's think about this for a second. If you have an offshore supply chain, everything on the left-hand side and above the dotted line, and you source those offshore because you have to, you can decide what configuration specific components you can source from other parts of other supply chains, either globalized or localized, and add in certain software domestically. And you can do what we call last mile integration at the very tail end of your supply chain. This is a lot of benefit for protecting IP, getting some redundancy. You'll notice that some of the simpler products can be produced by second-tier offshore contract manufacturers. You can get redundancy, get cost reduction as part of this. Similarly for your configuration specific, and then integrate with very low labor costs domestically or your last mile manufacturing partner. This can be done at multiple geographies. It does mean that one has to architect and think about the supply chain much more robustly, but you can actually structure and manage your supply chain quite a bit better. Let's see how this actually translates to this is a live example that's been disguised a bit, where product being sourced offshore in supply chain model 1 is transported by air at a very heavy cost, giving a total cost of landed cost of $40 before the product is delivered to the customer. So $20 plus $20 gives $40. That's the combined cost of supply chain model 1, which is an offshore model. Now, what we should have done is probably this type supply chain model 2, but here we have that for you now, where the actual product cost being sourced offshore is $10. But when it's transported, because it's much smaller, think of this now as a printed circuit board being flown over, you get a total landed cost of $12. You now source some products domestically, and you pay more money. Notice that your product cost was $20, but it actually went up to $25. So what you did was to source that component, the heavy components, bring them in by ocean container, or source them domestically and pay a little more freight. Those are really three parallel acquisition paths. You raise your product cost a bit, but you drop your transportation cost dramatically. Therefore, you end up saving significant money on your total supply chain cost. This is an example of a consumer device that, or a pseudo-consumer device that is sold to a lot of high volumes to businesses, being flown in, but actually being handled in a last mile manufacturing structure, and see what happens with transportation costs. we have multiple examples of this happening. Consumer devices and economics are typically very, very compelling. So this new model is adaptive, it's less volume sensitive, it's based on total landed costs, it protects your IP, and it's less exposed to risk in the three different categories outlined. Other considerations, it does bring economically justified jobs back to the U.S. It appeals to people that are socially responsible, but it appeals most important to people that are economically responsible. The only prerequisite, it does require companies to become more involved in their supply chain. I realize that may be hard after 20 years of throwing things over the fence or over the Great Wall, if you will, to the other end of the Pacific. But it's becoming extremely important for companies that want to structure and control their IP, want to control their own destiny, and realizing that Sarbanes-Oxley has made them look at the risk a little bit more. And not only is it the cost and IP protection, but it's also the risk discussion. So there's many reasons to become more involved in your supply chain. It is, after all, your supply chain. Let's do a quick case study. This is a retail mass configurable storage device that has multiple SKUs, very volatile demand for forecasts on inventory, where, as is typically the case in retail, the OEM effectively owns channel inventory through price protection, changing requirements from retailers, very high freight costs for fully packaged product, use of air freight because there was very little containerized transportation, but a heavy price erosion characteristics, but they had to preserve its own supply chain with glass buildings. Globalized assembly was the foundation of the supply chain, but flexibility was needed. So what we did was took an old model where everything was being flown in, fully configured, 2-week order lead time, which was considered pretty good in those days, but they were heavy stockouts for clients that wanted delivery 3 to 5 business days, high finished goods inventory, heavy unit cost. So we moved to the last mile manufacturing model, where the inbound freight costs were reduced dramatically, actually in this case by 95%. Over lead time was reduced to 3 days because the products were being fully configured domestically, flashed, firmware put onto them, the units packaged and labeled and brought out to retailers within 3 days. And then stockouts were reduced to less than 10%, and none of them due to configuration problems here, mostly related to supply availability problems offshore, unlike 40% in the previous. Finished goods inventory, finished goods is a bad place to maintain inventory, was reduced 80%. Rework costs of $100,000 a month were eliminated. So let's just step back a little bit, and although we realize that many of you may need to go through some level of analysis on this, let's just jump ahead a little bit and talk a little bit about if you were to implement this. Our suggestions are always start small, start in one geography, look at one product line, design your products for last mile manufacturing or flexibility, and realign risky steps into a last mile solution. We're happy to talk with you further about this. We realize we've gone a little bit over, so let's quickly take a couple of questions right after the summary. We think this is a huge opportunity for companies that have global supply chain. People are thinking this, rethinking this already. Many large companies that are well known in supply chain have already started re-engineering their supply chain. We think that those would get the fast mover advantages and will be able to realize gains quickly. The people that lag behind will actually see some competitive ground to the first movers. The last mile solution solves other significant issues. It's easy to implement in stages. There's significant US job benefits. We'd ask you to look at those by visiting lastmilemanufacturing.org. Look at our LinkedIn group, the Last Mile Manufacturing Unfurled group. and of course, visit the extroninc.com website. So with that, happy to move on to any questions. We only have a few minutes left, and certainly suggest that if anybody wishes to follow up, this is my contact information. With that, I'll turn things over back to Doug Nesbitt, our moderator. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Sandeep. We do have a few questions here, so in the interest of time, let's dive right into them. The first one is what components make for particularly good onshoring opportunities in order to reduce transportation costs?
Then I'll send the volume's a little tough in mind. Can you please repeat the question?
What types of components make for particularly good onshoring opportunities
yes.
to reduce transportation
Okay.
costs?
Well, first of all, components that aren't going to be very expensive, the price differential between offshore acquisition and onshore acquisition would not be very large. So let's take the example of mass-produced parts with low labor content, heavily automated in China, heavily automated domestically. Certain parts like those would be good characteristics, good targets for local acquisition. Other ones would be parts where you're doing very low volume acquisition, where the cost of procuring offshore and shipping low volumes onshore are very high, and it wouldn't be worthwhile doing that. Parts where that are heavy, and the transportation costs for acquisition, for procuring them acquisition offshore would be very high. You may wish to procure them onshore. So there are many. The key thing to look at it is the total lowest landed cost. So heavy, again, in summary, heavily mechanized, low volume, and heavy units would be good candidates for local acquisition. Throw in a plug for things with heavy IP where you don't want to release that IP offshore.
That's actually a good segue to another question that's here. What are some examples of that IP that probably should be onshore, things that you don't want offshore?
Things with heavily encrypted, things that have got a heavy data encryption, where you're joining encryption onto, for example, control chips. That control usage, for example, you don't want to give up the encryption code, not to mention it's illegal in many cases, doing anything beyond 128-bit encryption, maybe even 64-bit, I'm not really sure. But encryption, you're not allowed to export those. Providing integrated software, putting that offshore would be a very good choice, because the cost of putting software provisioning domestically is not very different than the cost of software provisioning offshore. For intellectual property, this is huge. Key hardware that you don't want to put offshore, like FPGAs, parts that are under allocation, where you're not going to be able to receive those parts and taking from one part of the world, sending to another part of the world, you use a lot of transportation time. And then generally places where there's not a lot of labor content, but you get significant IP savings, IP protection. In a IP protected country like the United States or Western Europe.
A couple more real quick here. How should returns be looked at in terms of product transportation costs? I mean, how does transportation costs fit into the world of return products?
I would say that with returns, the effective transportation costs are just more magnified. These twofold magnified, because not only do you have the double transportation involved, you're bringing goods in, but you're then sending them offshore to be replaced, to be fixed, and then transporting, in many cases, right back to the geography in which you're going to be reselling them. And of course, one product that would be the U.S. and Western Europe, and increasingly other parts of the world, but still 80% of the market would be in the U.S. and Western Europe. So you're really doubling and tripling the transportation cost versus just fixing those products. And the other thing that happens is that when you ship product offshore to be replaced, you're going to be putting a lot more in the inventory in the pipeline. The product is going to depreciate faster, you're going to need more inventory, and the cost of inventory just goes out of control. Return management is probably the first thing to be onshored from an inventory and a transportation perspective, but first line product is supposed to be brought back onshore from a IP protection and risk management perspective.
Sounds good. And then the last question we have here is, I think it must pertain to a comment you made towards the end. What's the best way to design for last mile manufacturing?
That's
kind of a big question.
That's a big question. You can write a book about that, if not, you can write certainly a chapter and a book about that, if not a whole book about that. One would have to design the product to be put together with low labor content. The final integration will be done with low labor content. Design the product so that software and key components get put on with low labor content and be put on at the very end. You have to design your product to be tested with certain key IP attributes missing up front. You have to design your supply chain so that you silo off subcontractors from one another. They don't know who they are. And just as an aside, I had $1 for every customer who said that product had been copied by a subcontractor, design given away, or employee of a subcontractor being dishonest and sold the design to somebody else, and then they find that they go into a third country, and the product's actually being sold without their knowing about it. I've had $1 for every one of those situations. I've had a lot of dollars in my pocket, not millions of dollars, but certainly thousands, maybe tens of thousands of dollars. So that is those are the only situations I've heard about, right? So that's a loaded question, a huge question, tough to answer in one sentence. I think there's a book about that.
Well, that's it for our questions. I want to thank all of you for joining today's webinar. We'll have a recording of this webinar available on Extron's website at www.extronbeat.com, And I want to wish all of you a great day. Again, thanks, Sandeep, for presenting today.
Thanks very much. Appreciate it. Pleasure. Appreciate everybody taking the time.
All right. Good afternoon, everybody.